There is a particular kind of silence that only certain people know, not the silence of an empty room, the silence of a full one, a holiday table, a birthday party, a wedding reception, the air thick with laughter and clinking glass, and the warm chaos of people who have known each other their whole lives. And somewhere inside that noise, one person sitting very still, smiling at the correct intervals, feeling, with absolute clarity, that they are not actually in the room. They are watching the room. They have always been watching the room, even as a child, even before they had language for what was happening to them. Some part of their awareness stood slightly outside the circle of belonging, taking notes nobody asked for, feeling everything nobody else seemed to feel, cataloging the small shifts in tone and posture that meant the evening was about to turn, long before anyone else noticed anything was wrong at all. If you know that silence, you already know more about your own psychology than most people learn in a lifetime. You just haven't been given the framework to understand what it means. Maybe it started at the dinner table itself, the place where most children learn the choreography of belonging without ever having to think about it, where laughter is contagious and arguments blow over, and love is simply assumed, like air, like gravity. For you it may have been different. Maybe the table was a place to be watched rather than welcomed. Maybe affection in your house arrived conditionally, given when you performed correctly and withdrawn, suddenly and without warning, when you did not. Maybe there was no dramatic event at all, no single bruise, no single slammed door you can point to and say, "There, that is where it broke." Only a long accumulation of small absences, a parent who was present in body and gone in attention, a household where your feelings were inconvenient before they were ever acknowledged. Trauma rarely announces itself with the volume people expect. More often, it arrives as a chronic, quiet withholding, and a child raised inside that withholding learns the loner's first lesson long before kindergarten: do not expect the room to hold you, learn to hold yourself. This video is for the people who were never quite able to belong. Not because they didn't try. God knows you tried. You contorted yourself into every shape that seemed like it might finally fit. And still, somehow, the fit never came. Not because you were unlikable, or strange, or too much, but because something happened, early, that severed the easy thread most people use to stay woven into the group. We are going to talk about what Carl Jung's psychology actually says about people like this, not the soft modern language of highly sensitive person or introvert, which flattens something far stranger and far more significant into a personality quiz result, a label you can wear without it ever asking anything difficult of you. We are going to talk about a structural difference in how the psyche develops when trauma arrives early enough to interrupt the normal process of belonging, and why the resulting solitude, as unbearable as it has often felt, may be evidence of something Jung considered exceedingly rare, almost unbearably rare, in a species built for the tribe. Before we go further, if this is already landing somewhere private in you, somewhere you don't usually let people see, if some part of you just quietly exhaled, the way the body exhales when it finally hears something true, stay with this. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, because this entire space exists for people exactly like you. People who have spent years feeling like the only one in the room who couldn't quite get in, who are about to learn they were never as alone in this as the loneliness convinced them they were. Let's begin where the wound actually begins. Not in adulthood, earlier. Always earlier than you remember consciously, because the body and the psyche begin keeping records long before the mind develops the language to read them. You have spent years, maybe decades, looking for a word for what you are. Empath, old soul, introvert, highly sensitive. Each of these words has offered you a little relief and then, eventually, fallen short, because each one describes a trait, a flavor of personality, something you might have simply been born with, the way you were born with a particular eye color, and none of them quite captures the deeper, stranger truth your body has always known, that you did not arrive at this distance from other people by temperament alone. You were placed there. Something happened to put you on the outside of the circle, looking in, long before you had any say in the matter. This is the validation almost no one gives you, because almost no one understands the architecture well enough to give it. Your aloneness is not a character flaw, and it is not, despite what years of well-meaning advice have implied, simply a habit you could break if you tried harder to put yourself out there. It is the visible scar tissue of an early developmental interruption, and scar tissue, as anyone who has ever actually healed from a wound knows, does not disappear just because someone tells you to stop noticing it. You learned, very young, to read a room before you were old enough to be safely in one. You learned to anticipate a parent's mood from the sound of a car door, the particular weight of footsteps in a hallway, the silence that meant something different from ordinary silence. You learned that your own needs, your own feelings, your own simple childhood wants were a kind of currency you had to spend carefully, because spending too freely sometimes cost you more than you could afford. None of that was your fault. None of it was a choice a child is capable of making. And all of it built, brick by brick, the particular kind of solitary watchfulness you have carried into every room you have ever walked into since. Jung spent the better part of his clinical life listening to people just like you, patients who came to him exhausted by a loneliness they could not explain, who had tried everything the culture told them to try: more friends, more activity, more performed sociability, and who still went home every night to the same hollow ache, the sense of having spent the entire day performing a version of belonging that was never quite real. What Jung discovered, again and again, in case after case, is that this kind of loneliness rarely responds to surface-level intervention, because it is not a surface-level wound. It lives in the architecture of the psyche itself, and it can only be addressed by going down into that architecture and rebuilding what was interrupted there. This is where Jung's framework becomes essential. Jung believed every child is born needing two things simultaneously, and the tragedy of most human development is that they pull against each other in ways most families never resolve well. The first need is connection, to be held inside a family, a tribe, a collective, to feel the warm gravitational pull of belonging that every social mammal requires simply to survive, the wordless certainty that one is wanted exactly as one is, without performance, without earning it. The second need is differentiation, to become eventually a distinct self, separate from the collective, capable of standing on one's own psychological feet, capable of knowing where the family ends and the individual begins. In a reasonably healthy childhood, these two needs unfold in a manageable order. Connection comes first, abundantly, almost unconditionally, soaking the child in the assumption of belonging before anything else is asked of them. Differentiation comes later, gradually, scaffolded by the safety the early connection provided. A teenager pushing against parents who can absorb the pushing. An adult slowly discovering their own values against a backdrop sturdy enough to hold the discovery. For the trauma-born loner, that order breaks. Something, a parent's coldness, an abandonment, an abuse, a chronic emotional neglect that never announced itself as a single dramatic event, but accumulated instead like sediment, year after year, silt collecting at the bottom of a riverbed until the water above it runs strange and shallow, interrupted the first need before it was ever satisfied. The child did not get to rest inside belonging long enough to take it for granted. Instead, very early, sometimes before memory itself solidifies into the continuous narrative adults rely on, that child learned a brutal lesson most people never have to learn until much later in life, if ever. The collective cannot be fully trusted to hold you. This is not a small lesson. It is, in the architecture of a developing psyche, foundational, the kind of early data point around which everything subsequent gets organized. A child who learns this at 5 organizes their entire nervous system around it. They learn to read faces with the urgency of someone reading weather before a storm. They learn that affection can be withdrawn, that safety is conditional, that the people who are supposed to be unconditional are in fact capable of becoming strangers without warning, And so, long before they have any conscious understanding of what they are doing, they begin building a second self, a self constructed not for connection, but for protection. Jung called this constructed self the persona, the mask each of us builds to interface with the social world, the curated, presentable self we offer so the tribe will accept us, distinct from the messier, more contradictory truth underneath. Most people build their persona slowly, almost lazily, layering it gradually over a secure inner foundation laid down by years of reliable love, and most people never have to examine it too closely because it serves them well enough, fits well enough, costs them little enough that the gap between the mask and the self beneath it never becomes urgent or visible. But the trauma-born child cannot afford that luxury. They build the persona early, and they build it consciously, not in the sense of deliberate calculation, a child is not capable of that, but in the sense that some watchful, frightened part of them is paying very close attention to the construction the entire time, because they have already learned, at an age when most children are still trustingly unconscious of the performance, that the wrong presentation gets you hurt, ignored, ridiculed, or abandoned. The mask, for this child, is not decor, it is survival architecture, it is load-bearing, and here is the strange gift hidden inside that early wound, the thing almost nobody tells you, the thing that might be the entire reason you are watching this video tonight instead of something else. Because that child had to consciously study the gap between the mask and the self underneath it, had to learn, with terrible precocity, the difference between what a person shows and what a person actually feels. They developed, decades ahead of schedule, a relationship with their own interior life, and with the interior life of others, that most adults never develop at all, not even by the time they die. They learn to watch themselves, to feel the seams of the performance, their own and everyone else's, to sense, with uncanny accuracy, when other people were performing too, which is the real origin of what gets casually labeled empath today, tossed around as though it were a magical gift bestowed at birth, like an eye color or a singing voice. It is not magic, it is not a gift in the sense of something given freely and without cost. It is a survival skill, forged alone, in conditions that should never have required it, refined over years of necessity until it became so precise it eventually registered, to you and to everyone around you, as a kind of perception bordering on the uncanny. This is the first reframe Jung's psychology offers, and it is worth sitting with for as long as it takes to actually land. Your loneliness was not a failure to belong. It was the side effect of a psyche that began the work of individuation, the lifelong project of becoming a whole, integrated self, the central task Jung devoted his entire career to mapping, decades before it was developmentally supposed to. You did not choose early individuation. It was forced on you, the way a tree forced to grow in poor, rocky soil sends its roots deeper and stranger and further than a tree given everything it needs from the start, a tree that never had to learn what scarcity does to a living thing, never had to develop the particular intelligence that only deprivation teaches. But forced or not, what grew from it is real. It cost you enormously, and it is rare. There is a recurring dream pattern among people who carry this history, and Jung, who treated the dream as the most honest language the psyche possesses, more honest in many ways than the waking mind, which has learned to lie to itself in order to function, would have paid close attention to it. The dreamer finds themselves at a gathering, a party, a family dinner, a crowded street, sometimes a wedding, sometimes simply a room full of indistinct figures, whose context the dreaming mind never bothers to clarify, and everyone around them is speaking, but the dreamer cannot quite make out the words. Sound without language. A murmur, a hum, the texture of conversation with none of its content. The faces around them are friendly, even loving, but somehow generically rendered, smudged at the edges, as though the dreaming mind could not be bothered to individuate them, because in some sense they are not separate people in the dream at all. They are the collective, A single organism, wearing many interchangeable faces, moving and laughing and embracing in a warm, continuous rhythm, and the dreamer stands at its edge, present but unabsorbed, watching the organism breathe and pulse and carry on its life, perfectly visible to it, and yet somehow never quite touched by it. Some dreamers report trying to speak in this dream and finding their voice will not carry. They open their mouths and the sound dissolves before it reaches anyone, swallowed by the murmur of the crowd, as though the dream itself were illustrating a lifetime's experience of feeling unheard, even while standing in plain sight. Others report a different and perhaps even more haunting variation. They are inside the warm circle, embraced, included, laughing along with everyone else, and then they wake, and in the seconds before full consciousness returns, there is a fresh, sharp grief, because some part of them already knows the warmth was only ever available in sleep. Jung would call this dream a near-literal portrait of the dreamer's relationship to the collective unconscious, his term for the deep substrate of shared human experience, instinct, myth, and inherited pattern that underlies individual consciousness, the way roots underlie a forest, invisible, connecting every tree to every other tree beneath the visible soil, sharing nutrients, sharing signals of danger and abundance, bound together in a network no single tree could perceive from above ground. Most people live comfortably immersed in that collective layer without ever needing to examine it. They absorb its values, its rhythms, its unspoken rules of belonging, the way a fish absorbs water, without registering it as a separate medium at all. It is simply the element they move through, invisible because it is everywhere. The trauma-born loner, by contrast, was expelled, sometimes brutally, in a single defining event, more often only quietly, through years of accumulated small withdrawals, from full immersion in that medium, at an age when expulsion should not yet be psychologically possible, before a child has any other foundation to fall back on, and so they grew up half in the water and half out of it, fluent in the collective's language, able to read its currents with frightening precision, able to translate a room's emotional weather in seconds, and yet never fully submerged in it the way everyone around them seemed to be, never granted the simple unconscious ease of belonging that most people never even notice they have, because they have never had to live without it. This is why so many people who carry this history describe a specific aching paradox, the central paradox of their entire emotional life. They can walk into any room and instantly read its temperature, sense who is angry beneath their smile, who is grieving beneath their composure, who is performing confidence over a private terror that no one else in the room has noticed, and yet they themselves remain unread, unreached, profoundly alone even inside rooms full of people who claim, sincerely, to love them. They have become so skilled at perceiving others that almost no one has ever returned the favor. The gift and the wound are the same organ. You cannot have the perception without the distance that produced it. You cannot have the depth of seeing without having first been, painfully, unseen. There is a second archetype worth naming here, because it sharpens the picture considerably, and Jung returned to it often when describing the psychological cost of arrested or accelerated development, the Puer Aeternus, the eternal child, and its less discussed, almost mirror image counterpart, the prematurely-aged child, the one who never got to be young because the collective demanded an adult of them before childhood had finished doing its necessary work. Most people fear the Puer Aeternus pattern, the adult who never grew up, who avoids commitment, depth, responsibility, staying perpetually adolescent in spirit, perpetually waiting for real life to begin, because some part of development was skipped or indulged past its natural season. The trauma-born loner often carries the inverse wound, less discussed in popular psychology but equally disfiguring in its own way, a childhood interrupted by a forced adulthood, where the child became the emotional caretaker of the household, the silent observer who managed everyone else's moods before they had the cognitive tools to manage their own, the one who had to understand the adults around them before any adult ever bothered to understand the child. This produces a peculiar psychological signature, one you may recognize in yourself with an almost uncomfortable accuracy, someone who feels, at 25, at 40, at 70, vaguely ancient inside, as though they have already lived several lives' worth of weariness and watchfulness, while simultaneously carrying a tender, frozen, unmet childlike need underneath all that premature wisdom, a need that never got its turn, that is still, quietly, somewhere beneath the competent adult exterior, waiting to be noticed. This duality explains something that confuses people who carry this history and confuses the people who try to love them: the strange coexistence of profound capability and profound fragility in the same person. You may be the one everyone turns to in a crisis, calm under pressure, able to hold other people's grief without flinching, able to see 10 steps ahead in any difficult situation, and yet utterly undone, disproportionately undone, by a small slight, a moment of being overlooked, a friend who forgets to ask how you are, after listening to you ask how they are for the 100th time. People around you find this confusing. They expect your competence to extend everywhere, not realizing that the competence was built on top of an unhealed wound, not in spite of it, and that the wound itself remains exactly as young, exactly as raw, as the age at which it first occurred. This is the real architecture of the loner identity that Jung's framework illuminates with such precision. Not introversion, not social anxiety, though those may coexist with it as secondary symptoms. A psyche that was split, early, into a precociously perceptive outer self and a still young, still grieving inner self that never got the chance to be held the way it needed to be held. The two do not always speak to each other. The competent adult often has no idea the unheld child is still there, still keeping the same vigil it kept 30 years ago, still flinching at the sound of a particular tone of voice, still bracing for a withdrawal of love that may never come again, but that the body has never been told is safe to stop expecting. Healing, in the Jungian sense, is not about becoming more sociable, more outgoing, more comfortable at parties. It is about reuniting those two split halves, bringing the watchful adult and the unheld child back into relationship with one another, inside the same psyche, so the loneliness finally has somewhere to rest instead of circling forever, unanswered, looking for an external solution to what is, at its root, an internal estrangement. There is another dimension to this architecture that Jung's psychology insists we not skip past, because it explains a pattern that has likely confused and exhausted you in your closest relationships, the way the trauma-born loner often relates, almost compulsively, to an inner figure Jung called the anima, in men, or the animus, in women, the contrasexual inner image, the carrier of everything a person has not consciously developed in themselves, often projected outward onto romantic partners with devastating intensity. For the person who grew up having to manage other people's emotions before they were permitted their own, the inner feminine or inner masculine, whichever is unconscious for them, often becomes overloaded with everything that was never safe to express directly. A man raised to suppress tenderness in favor of competence may find his anima, his inner feeling function, projected with startling force onto the first woman who seems to offer the emotional permission he never gave himself, and then feel devastated, almost betrayed, when she turns out to be a separate person with her own needs, rather than the perfect emotional mirror his unconscious was searching for. A woman raised to manage everyone's moods before her own may find her animus, her inner capacity for assertion and independent judgment, projected onto a man who seems to embody the decisiveness she was never allowed to claim for herself, and then find herself, again and again, drawn to partners who are strong in exactly the way she has not yet learned to be strong on her own behalf. This is not a flaw unique to trauma survivors. Jung considered anima and animus projection a near-universal feature of romantic love, the reason falling in love so often feels like recognizing someone rather than meeting them. But for the trauma-born loner, the projection carries unusual weight, because the isolation has left so much of the inner contrasexual figure undeveloped, untouched, ravenous for expression. Relationships, for this person, often arrive with an intensity that frightens even them, a sense of having finally been met, finally seen all the way down, followed, almost inevitably, by a crushing disappointment when the other person cannot sustain the impossible role of single-handedly completing a wholeness that can only, in the end, be built from the inside. Understanding this does not mean abandoning the hope of love. It means understanding what love is actually being asked to carry, and slowly, deliberately, taking some of that weight back, reclaiming the tenderness, the assertion, the unclaimed half of yourself, so that the people you love can be loved for who they actually are, rather than worshipped or resented for who your unconscious needed them to be. There is one more thread the culture rarely mentions when it talks about isolation, and Jung considered it among the most important: synchronicity, his term for meaningful coincidence, events linked not by cause and effect but by significance, arriving at precisely the moment the psyche most needs them. People who have lived for years with the particular ache of trauma-born loneliness often report, almost sheepishly, a pattern they cannot quite explain and have learned not to mention at dinner parties: the right book appearing at exactly the right moment, a stranger's offhand sentence landing with the precision of a message meant only for them, a song surfacing at the exact hour of a private grief no one else could have known about. Jung did not dismiss these moments as coincidence, and he was, by training, a scientist, not a mystic indulging in wishful thinking. He proposed instead that the unconscious, when a person is engaged in genuine psychological work, when the watchful adult finally turns to look for the unheld child, when the long isolation finally begins to be examined, rather than merely endured, begins to communicate not only through dream, but through the outer world itself, arranging correspondences between inner state and outer event that defy ordinary causal explanation. For the person who has spent a lifetime feeling unaccompanied by other people, this is not a small claim. It suggests that the very isolation that has felt, for so long, like proof of abandonment, may in fact be the precondition for a different and rarer kind of company, not the noisy, crowded belonging of the dinner table you were excluded from, but a quieter, more numinous sense of being met by something larger than any single relationship could offer, at exactly the moments the solitude becomes unbearable enough to demand it. This is not offered as consolation for the absence of human connection, which remains a real and legitimate need. It is offered as evidence that the psyche, even in its loneliest configurations, is not indifferent to the person carrying it. Something in you has been listening the entire time. Something has been answering, in its own oblique and patient language, long before you had the framework to recognize the reply. Here is the line worth keeping, the one that names what has actually been happening underneath all those years of feeling like the only one in the room who couldn't quite get in. You were not too sensitive for this world. You were too early for it. A psyche built for a depth of relating that most people will not develop until their own collapse forces them to, decades from now, if it ever forces them at all. That is the meaning behind the 1% framing, stripped of its clickbait skin and given its actual psychological weight. Jung did not believe individuation, true, conscious wholeness, the integration of shadow and persona, and the buried, unlived life into a coherent self, was common. He believed most people live and die almost entirely identified with their persona, comfortable inside the collective, never once turning to look at what they had to disown in order to fit there. The trauma-born loner was denied that comfortable unconsciousness. Cast out early, forced into self-examination before self-examination was safe or wanted, before they had any choice in the matter at all, they were handed, against their will and at terrible cost, a head start on the very process most human beings spend an entire lifetime avoiding, often successfully, often right up until death. This does not erase the suffering. It does not make the isolation, the years of feeling unseen, the ache of watching everyone else move easily through a belonging you could never quite locate, any less real or any less painful. Jung was never interested in pretending suffering was secretly fine, secretly a blessing in disguise, the kind of thin spiritual platitude that asks the wounded to be grateful for their wounding. He was interested in something harder and more honest, that suffering, faced rather than fled, examined rather than merely survived, becomes the raw material of the only kind of strength that actually lasts, the only kind that does not collapse the first time life applies real pressure. The alchemists he studied called the necessary darkening before transformation, the nigredo, and the trauma-born loner has often lived an entire childhood inside that blackening, alone, without a name for what was happening to them, without anyone to tell them it was the beginning of something, rather than only the end of belonging. What comes next, if the work continues, if the watchful adult and the unheld child inside you are slowly, deliberately brought into relationship through honest reflection, through grief finally allowed to move, instead of freezing in place where it has stood guard for decades, through the patient work Jung called active imagination, sitting with your own inner images instead of fleeing them, asking the figure in the dream room what it came to say instead of waking before it answers, is not a cure for loneliness exactly. It is something stranger and better. It is the capacity to be alone without being abandoned by yourself. The two are not the same thing, though for years they may have felt identical, indistinguishable, two names for the same wound. Solitude, once the split is healed, stops being exile and starts being sanctuary. The same silence that once meant I do not belong here can, with time and deliberate inner work, come to mean something closer to I have finally come home to the one relationship I never actually lost, the one with myself. The dinner table you could never quite belong to was never the only table available to you. There is another one, set inside, where the watcher and the watched finally sit down together, and the meal, this time, is not performance, it is recognition. This does not mean the longing for human connection disappears, or that it should. Jung was never an advocate for permanent withdrawal into the self as a substitute for relationship. He considered relationship, real relationship, one of the great vehicles of individuation, not its enemy. But the trauma-born loner who does the inner work arrives at relationship differently than they once did, not desperate for it to complete them, not terrified of its loss as a referendum on their worth, but capable, for the first time, of choosing connection from a place of wholeness rather than reaching for it from a place of absence. That difference changes everything about who is drawn toward you and who you are finally able to let close. You were not broken by what cast you out of easy belonging. You were initiated by it, early and without consent, into a kind of seeing most people never acquire in a single lifetime. The work now is not to force yourself back into the noisy room, pretending the watching was a flaw to be corrected, performing a sociability that was never natural to you and never will be. The work is to bring the child who was never fully held into the same room as the adult who learned, the hard way, how to watch, and let them, finally, sit together. Let the vigil end. Let the watching become witnessing, the witnessing become tenderness, and the tenderness, slowly, become a kind of company that no crowded room was ever able to give you. If this found something in you tonight, it was not an accident, and it will not be the last time something on this channel reaches that part of you. The next video on this channel goes deeper into the unheld inner child Jung, called the divine child archetype, and what it actually takes to bring that buried part of the self back into the light, out of the room with the dust-covered furniture, into the part of the house where the lamps are finally lit. Like this video, subscribe, and stay close. There is more of your own story waiting in the next room, and you do not have to walk into it alone this time.